Stay with me, because at 30,000 feet, one decision turned a marriage into a crime scene no one could walk away from. The roar of the engines filled the private jet as a bright red suitcase spun out into the open sky, shrinking into nothing while Emily Carter stood frozen in the aisle, one hand instinctively resting on her 7-month belly, her breath shallow, her world suddenly weightless, and across from her, Nathaniel Brooks didn't even flinch, his cufflinks catching the cabin. Light as if nothing unusual had just happened, as if he hadn't just thrown away the last pieces of her life like they meant nothing. And maybe to him, they didn't, because Nathaniel Brooks was the kind of billionaire who believed everything had a price, even people, especially people, and Emily had learned that slowly, quietly, over the past 2 years, in the way conversations turned into commands. In the way her opinions stopped mattering, in the way her name slowly disappeared from everything they once shared, but this moment, this altitude, this silence after the suitcase vanished into the clouds, this was different. This was final, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, almost bored, like he was handling a minor inconvenience, not dismantling a life. "You're not needed where I'm going, Emily," he said, adjusting his watch as if time itself answered to him, and the words landed heavier than anything that had just been thrown out of the plane, because they weren't about luggage, they were about erasing her completely, and for a second, Emily didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, because something inside her wasn't breaking, it was calculating, remembering, replaying a moment from exactly 3 minutes earlier, when she had quietly stepped into the rear of the cabin, her fingers trembling just enough to feel real, dialing a number she hadn't used in years. And when the voice on the other end answered, she hadn't explained, she hadn't needed to, she had only said 5 words. "I'm on his plane." "No." And hung up. And now, standing there as the sky swallowed her past, she exhaled slowly, because Nathaniel thought he had control, he always thought he had control, but control is fragile at 30,000 feet, especially when you forget who's flying the plane, and that's when the intercom clicked, a soft mechanical sound that sliced through the cabin like a quiet warning, followed by a voice that didn't belong to a stranger, didn't belong to a hired pilot, but to someone who knew exactly who Emily Carter was, someone who had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone realized. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice said, steady, composed, almost too calm, "we'll be making a slight change in direction." And Nathaniel's expression shifted for the first time, just slightly, just enough to notice, because billionaires aren't used to detours, and Emily lifted her eyes, meeting the closed cockpit door with something that looked almost like relief. Because the man who had just thrown her life into the sky had no idea that the real fall hadn't even begun yet. The hum of the engines did not change, but something else did, something invisible yet unmistakable, like the air itself had shifted direction, and Nathaniel Brooks felt it before he understood it, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at Emily, searching for the reaction he expected, fear, panic, pleading, but she stood still, too still, her breathing steady now, her hand resting over her belly not in defense but in quiet certainty. And that unsettled him more than anything else could have, because Emily Carter had never looked at him like that before, not in 2 years of marriage, not even on their worst days, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, the illusion of control he wore like a second skin began to crack. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but no longer casual. And Emily did not answer right away, she let the silence stretch, let it press against him the way his words had pressed against her minutes earlier, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost reflective. "I remembered who I am," she said, and that answer meant nothing to him, not yet, but it would, very soon, because at the front of the aircraft, behind a reinforced door designed to keep danger out, a man sat with his hands steady on the controls, his eyes fixed on a new flight path glowing across the navigation screen, one that did not match the billionaire's itinerary, one that had been quietly approved through channels Nathaniel Brooks did not own, and Daniel Carter exhaled slowly, not from fear, but from restraint, because he had spent years learning discipline, learning when to act and when to wait, and right now, waiting was the most powerful move he had, the headset pressed against his ear carried the sound of the cabin, the faint echo of voices, the shift in tone, the moment when power began to tilt, and he had heard enough, more than enough, because 3 minutes earlier, when his sister's call came through, he had not asked questions, he had not needed details, he had recognized something in her voice that no training manual could define, something final, something that demanded action, and now, as he adjusted the aircraft's heading by just a few degrees, subtle enough to go unnoticed by anyone not trained to read the sky, he knew this was no longer just a flight, this was a controlled descent into truth. Back in the cabin, Nathaniel stepped forward, his presence filling the narrow space, his confidence returning in measured steps as he reached for the intercom panel, pressing the button with the certainty of a man who expected obedience. "This is Nathaniel Brooks," he said, his tone sharp, authoritative. "Return to the original course immediately." But the response did not come right away, and that pause, that small delay, landed heavier than any refusal could have, because it was unfamiliar, unacceptable, and when the voice finally returned, it was calm, almost respectful, but entirely unmoved. "Sir, for safety reasons, we will be landing at a different location." And that was the moment everything shifted, because Nathaniel Brooks did not hear safety, he heard defiance, and defiance was something he had built an empire avoiding, eliminating, controlling, and now it was happening inside his own aircraft, beyond his reach, and he turned back to Emily, expecting anger, expecting confusion, but what he saw instead was something far more dangerous: composure, the kind that does not come from power, but from knowing that power has already changed hands, and she met his gaze without hesitation, without apology, and for the first time, Nathaniel realized that whatever he had tried to discard at 30,000 feet had not been lost, it had been transferred, redirected, and somewhere ahead of them, beyond the clouds and beyond his influence, something was waiting, something prepared. Something that had been set in motion long before he ever opened that cabin door, and as the plane continued forward on its new path, steady and irreversible, the distance between what Nathaniel believed he controlled and what was actually unfolding grew wider with every passing mile, until even he could feel it, the quiet, undeniable truth that this was no longer his flight to command. The cabin felt smaller now, not because the space had changed, but because control had. And Nathaniel Brooks understood control better than anyone. He built companies on it, closed deals with it, shaped people with it, but this was different. This was slipping through his fingers in a way that logic could not immediately fix, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. His jaw tightened as he stepped closer to Emily, lowering his voice as if proximity alone could restore order. "You are making a mistake you cannot undo," he said, each word measured, calculated to reassert dominance. But Emily did not step back, she did not look away, and that was new, that was wrong, because the woman he married used to absorb tension, used to soften conflict, used to bend just enough to keep peace intact. But the woman standing in front of him now did not bend, she held still like something anchored far deeper than fear, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the steady hum of the aircraft slicing through open sky, a reminder that they were suspended between two realities. One he believed he controlled, and one that had already begun to rewrite itself. "You think this changes anything?" Nathaniel continued, his tone sharpening, reaching for certainty the way he always did. "Do you know what happens when we land, Emily? Do you understand the kind of influence you are challenging?" And there it was, the language of power, the reminder of who he was supposed to be in this story, the man who owned outcomes. But Emily exhaled slowly, almost quietly, and for the first time since the plane had shifted course, there was something in her expression that looked like clarity, not reaction, not resistance, but clarity. "I already know what happens when we land," she said, and the difference between knowing and assuming hung in the air like a line he could not cross, because Nathaniel had always assumed outcomes, but Emily had already seen one, and that distinction, subtle but absolute, began to unravel everything he thought was fixed. At the front of the aircraft, Daniel Carter adjusted his headset slightly, listening as ground communications came through with quiet confirmation, a private runway secured, legal representatives already on site. Documentation prepared and verified, every piece aligned with precision that did not come from impulse, but from preparation, because Daniel had not just answered a call, he had activated a system, one built quietly over time, one that did not rely on wealth or reputation, but on something far less visible and far more difficult to dismantle: truth recorded, documented, undeniable. And as he glanced at the cabin monitor displaying a live feed, he saw his sister standing there, composed, steady, no longer reacting to a man who believed himself untouchable, and Daniel allowed himself a single controlled breath, because this moment, this exact moment, was where everything turned, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with exposure. Back in the cabin, Nathaniel reached for his phone, his movements sharp now, precise, dialing numbers that had always answered, contacts that had always responded, but one by one, the calls did not connect, redirected, delayed, unanswered. And each failed attempt pressed against him like a quiet contradiction, because systems he trusted were no longer responding the way they should, and systems that fail in silence are the most dangerous kind. "What did you set up?" he demanded, the control in his voice cracking just enough to reveal something beneath it, something unfamiliar, uncertainty. And Emily watched him for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with something closer to recognition, like she was finally seeing him without the illusion that once defined him. "Nothing you did not already start," she said, and that answer did not comfort him, it did the opposite, because it suggested that this outcome was not sudden, not accidental, but inevitable, built piece by piece from decisions he had made long before this flight ever took off, and outside the windows, the sky stretched endless and indifferent, a vast quiet that did not care about power or wealth or status, only direction, and inside that aircraft, direction had already changed, not just the flight path, but the story itself. And as the first signs of descent began, subtle but unmistakable, Nathaniel Brooks realized that for the first time in years, he was not arriving somewhere he had chosen, he was being taken somewhere he could not control. And the distance between those two things was everything. The subtle shift of descent pressed gently against the cabin, barely noticeable to anyone who was not paying attention, but Nathaniel Brooks noticed everything, especially when control was slipping away. And now even gravity felt like it was working against him. His stance adjusted instinctively as he braced himself, not physically, but mentally, recalculating, reordering, searching for leverage in a situation that refused to obey his expectations. "You think landing somewhere else changes the outcome?" he said, his voice regaining a sharp edge, clinging to authority like a lifeline. "I will have people waiting wherever this plane touches down." And for a moment, that sounded like the truth, because it always had been, because Nathaniel Brooks had built a life where outcomes were arranged before events even began. But Emily Carter did not react, she did not challenge him, she simply listened, and then she shook her head once. Slowly, not in disagreement, but in quiet certainty. "Not this time," she said, and those 3 words carried something unfamiliar, something final, and it unsettled him more than any argument could have. Because certainty without explanation is the most dangerous kind, it cannot be negotiated, it cannot be bought, and as the aircraft continued its steady descent, the landscape below beginning to take shape through the cabin windows, something else became clear. This was not a commercial airport, not a place designed for anonymity or convenience. This was smaller, more controlled, a private runway set apart from everything else. And that detail mattered because private spaces belonged to someone. And for the first time since takeoff, Nathaniel did not know who that someone was. At the front of the plane, Daniel Carter confirmed final approach coordinates, his voice calm, professional, giving nothing away. Because this was not about confrontation, it was about precision, and precision required discipline. He reviewed the sequence one last time: ground team in position, legal observers present, documentation secured, every step aligned with regulations Nathaniel could not override. Because this was not his system, this was one built outside his reach, designed specifically for moments like this. And as the runway lights aligned perfectly beneath the aircraft, Daniel allowed himself a single thought, not of victory, but of completion, because what mattered was not what happened in the air, it was what would happen when they touched ground. Back in the cabin, Nathaniel moved again, faster now, his phone still in his hand. His calls unanswered, his influence delayed by barriers he did not yet understand, and that delay was everything, because time had always been his advantage, but now it was working against him, stretching just enough to let something else take hold. "You are overestimating whatever you think you have done," he said, his tone tightening, trying to pull the moment back into something familiar, something he could dominate. But Emily's gaze did not waver, and when she spoke, her voice was not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "No, Nathaniel," she said. "You are underestimating what you already did." And that difference, that inversion of perspective, landed harder than any accusation, because it reframed everything, not as a sudden betrayal, but as a consequence, something that had been building quietly, patiently, beneath the surface of a life he thought he controlled, and for a brief second, he saw it, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that this moment was not isolated, it was connected, tied to decisions he had dismissed, actions he had minimized, words he had spoken without consequence until now, and outside the windows, the ground rose closer. The runway stretching forward like a line that could not be avoided, and inside the aircraft, the silence returned, heavier this time, filled with things unsaid but fully understood, because when power shifts, it does not announce itself loudly, it settles, quietly, firmly, until it is undeniable, the landing gear deployed with a low mechanical hum, a sound that marked transition, not just from air to ground, but from assumption to reality, and Nathaniel Brooks stood there. No longer the man directing the journey, but the one being carried toward an outcome he did not design, and as the wheels touched down, smooth, controlled, irreversible, he realized that whatever waited beyond that runway was not something he could negotiate, not something he could dismiss, it was something already decided, and for the first time in a very long time, Nathaniel Brooks was arriving somewhere without control. And Emily Carter was not afraid of what came next. The aircraft slowed as it rolled along the private runway, the sound of rubber meeting asphalt echoing through the cabin like a quiet final statement, not dramatic, not chaotic, just controlled, precise, inevitable, and that was what made it different, because nothing about this moment belonged to Nathaniel Brooks anymore, not the direction, not the timing, not even the silence that followed as the engines powered down and the world outside came into full view, a line of black vehicles stationed at a distance, unmoving, waiting. Not like chauffeurs, not like business partners, but like something official. Something prepared, and Nathaniel saw them the same moment Emily did, his eyes narrowing as his mind moved quickly, calculating possibilities, adjusting expectations, searching for familiarity in a situation that refused to give it. "This is not authorized," he said sharply, more to himself than to anyone else, as if naming the problem could undo it. But authorization was no longer his to grant, and that realization settled slowly, heavily, like gravity reasserting itself after a long suspension. The cabin door remained closed for a moment longer, just enough time to stretch the silence into something meaningful, and then the intercom clicked again, the same calm voice, the same controlled tone. "We have arrived," Daniel Carter said, nothing more, nothing less, and in those 3 words there was no deference, no hesitation, only completion. The door to the cockpit opened seconds later, and for the first time since the flight began, the man behind the controls stepped into view, his posture steady, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakable, and when his eyes met Emily's, something unspoken passed between them. Not surprise, not relief, but recognition, like two people who had already understood the outcome long before it became visible, and Nathaniel turned toward him, his composure tightening, reforming into something sharper, more defensive. "You have made a very serious mistake," he said, his voice returning to that familiar edge, the one that had closed deals and silenced opposition. But Daniel did not react, not the way others would have. He simply held Nathaniel's gaze for a brief moment before shifting his attention back to Emily, and that shift, that deliberate refusal to engage on Nathaniel's terms, landed harder than any response, because power that does not acknowledge you is power you cannot control. Outside, the vehicles remained still, their presence patient, unhurried, as if time itself had already been accounted for, and inside the cabin, the balance continued to tilt, not dramatically, not loudly, but with quiet certainty. Nathaniel took a step forward, attempting to reclaim the the narrative, anything that still responded to him. "Open the door," he said, directing the command toward no one in particular, expecting it to be followed simply because he had said it, but no one moved, not immediately, and that pause, that fraction of a second where nothing happened, stretched longer than it should have, long enough to make something very clear. Commands without authority are just words, and Nathaniel Brooks had just spoken words that no longer carried weight. Emily watched it happen, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet understanding, like she was witnessing the exact moment a structure collapsed under its own design. And she shifted slightly, her hands still resting over her belly, her posture grounded in a way it had not been before, because for the first time, she was not reacting to him, she was standing ahead of him, and when she finally moved toward the door, it was not with hesitation, not with permission, but with intention. Daniel stepped aside without a word, giving her space, not leading, not directing, just allowing, and that distinction mattered. Because this was not about replacing one control with another, it was about ending it entirely. The cabin door unlocked with a soft mechanical click, and as it opened, the outside air rushed in, carrying with it a different kind of silence, one that did not belong to altitude or isolation, but to something waiting, something already in motion. And as Emily took her first step toward the exit, Nathaniel realized that whatever happened next was not something he could interrupt, not something he could negotiate. It was something that had already been decided long before he ever chose to throw anything away, and now, standing just behind her, with the world he built no longer responding the way it used to, Nathaniel Brooks faced something he had never truly experienced before, not loss of money, not loss of status, but loss of control, complete and undeniable. And the door was already open. The first step onto the metal stairs felt different, not because of the ground beneath them, but because of everything that no longer stood behind her. And Emily Carter did not rush, she did not hesitate, she simply moved forward at her own pace, one step, then another, the open air meeting her face with a calm that did not ask for permission, and below, the figures waiting beside the line of dark vehicles remained exactly where they were, composed, deliberate, not approaching, not retreating, just present, and that presence carried more authority than any command Nathaniel Brooks had given in the last 10 minutes, because it did not need to speak, it had already been acknowledged. Behind her, Nathaniel followed, not out of choice, but because there was nowhere else to go, the aircraft no longer his domain, the cabin no longer his space. And as his shoes touched the steps, something in his posture shifted. Subtle but undeniable, the confidence that once filled every movement now measured, restrained, as if even he understood that whatever waited below was not something he could dominate through force of will alone. The distance between them and the ground closed slowly, each step marking a transition, not just from flight to landing, but from assumption to consequence. And when Emily reached the tarmac, she paused for a fraction of a second. Not in uncertainty, but in awareness, because this was the moment everything became visible. No more altitude to hide behind, no more distance to delay what had already begun. The nearest vehicle door opened without sound, and a man stepped forward, dressed in a dark suit, his posture formal but not aggressive, his expression neutral, as if he were part of a system that operated without emotion. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice clear, respectful, and Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging him not as someone in control, but as someone fulfilling a role already defined. And Nathaniel stopped just behind her, his gaze moving quickly across the scene, scanning faces, searching for recognition, for familiarity, for any thread he could pull to regain influence. But there was none, only structure, only order, only people who were not reacting to him, and that absence of reaction was louder than anything else could have been. "This is unnecessary," Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through the stillness, sharper now, edged with something closer to urgency. "Whatever this is, it can be resolved privately." And the words sounded reasonable, controlled, even persuasive, the language of someone accustomed to turning problems into negotiations. But the man in front of Emily did not respond immediately. He allowed the silence to settle, allowed the statement to exist without validation, and then he spoke, his tone unchanged. "All matters have already been documented," he said, And that sentence carried weight not because of how it was delivered, but because of what it implied, that this was not a conversation, not a negotiation, not something that could be adjusted in real time. It was a process already in motion, one that did not require Nathaniel's agreement to continue, and for the first time since stepping onto the runway, Nathaniel's expression shifted again, not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough to reveal something deeper, something he could no longer fully conceal, the realization that influence has limits, and he had just reached one. Emily took a slow breath, the air steady, grounding, and for a brief moment she closed her eyes. Not to escape, but to center herself, because this moment was not about reaction, it was about presence, about standing in the exact place where everything changed and not stepping back. And when she opened her eyes again, there was no hesitation left, only direction. Daniel remained at the top of the stairs, watching, not intervening, not guiding, simply ensuring that what needed to happen would continue without interruption, his role complete in the air, but not yet finished on the ground. Because protection is not always about action, sometimes it is about making sure nothing interferes with what has already been set in motion. And as the man in the suit stepped slightly to the side, gesturing toward the waiting vehicles, Emily understood without words that this was the next step, the continuation, the part of the story that would not unfold in the sky, but here, in full view, in a place where everything could be seen, recorded, acknowledged. And Nathaniel Brooks, standing just behind her, realized that for the first time in years he was not walking into a room he controlled, he was being led into one that had already decided his role, and there was nothing left to negotiate. The door of the nearest vehicle closed with a quiet precision that seemed to seal more than just space, it sealed the moment, and as Emily Carter sat back against the leather seat, the outside world shifted from something immediate into something observed, controlled, contained, and across from her, the man in the dark suit reviewed a tablet without urgency, as if everything unfolding had already been accounted for long before she stepped off the aircraft, and that realization did not overwhelm her. It steadied her, because for the first time in a long time, she was not catching up to events, she was aligned with them. Outside, Nathaniel Brooks hesitated for half a second before entering the vehicle behind hers, and that hesitation was small, almost invisible, but it mattered because hesitation had never been part of his rhythm, not in business, not in life, and certainly not in situations where he believed he held authority. But authority does not survive without recognition, and here, on this quiet private runway, recognition had shifted completely. The convoy moved without unnecessary speed, smooth, deliberate, each turn executed with the kind of precision that comes from coordination rather than reaction, and inside the vehicle, silence held, not tense, not uncertain, just present, until Emily finally spoke, her voice calm, measured. "Where are we going?" she asked, not out of fear, but out of clarity, and the man across from her looked up briefly, meeting her gaze with the same steady composure. "To a place where everything is already waiting," he replied, and that answer did not explain, but it confirmed that this was not spontaneous, not improvised, but structured, intentional, and that structure extended far beyond the runway they had just left. In the vehicle behind, Nathaniel's phone buzzed once, then again, delayed messages finally pushing through, fragmented updates from assistants. Alerts from systems that were only now catching up to a reality that had already shifted, and he read them quickly, his expression tightening with each line, because what he saw was not chaos, it was coordination, accounts flagged, communications rerouted, meetings cancelled without his authorization, and none of it made sense. If he was still in control, but control was exactly what had been removed, not loudly, not publicly, but precisely piece by piece, until what remained was only the appearance of power without its function, and that distinction, subtle but absolute, became impossible to ignore. The vehicles turned onto a long private drive, the kind that signals exclusivity, separation from public space, and ahead, a building came into view, modern, understated, not designed to impress, but to operate, and that difference mattered because impressive spaces are built for perception, operational spaces are built for outcomes. And as the convoy came to a smooth stop, the doors opened in sequence, not rushed, not chaotic, just exact. Emily stepped out first, her movements steady, her posture grounded, and for a brief moment, she looked up at the building, not with uncertainty, but with recognition, because whatever waited inside. She had already chosen to face it, and behind her, Nathaniel exited his vehicle, slower now, his gaze fixed on the same structure, but seeing it differently, not as an opportunity, not as a place he could shape, but as something already shaped without him. "This is not necessary," he said again, the words sounding thinner this time, less like authority and more like resistance to something inevitable, and no one responded, not because they did not hear him, but because the statement no longer required acknowledgement. Inside, the doors opened automatically, revealing a space that felt controlled in a different way, quiet, efficient, purposeful, and as Emily stepped forward, the sound of her footsteps echoed softly against polished floors, marking each step as part of a process that had already begun, and Nathaniel followed, not because he agreed, but because there was no path that did not lead forward, and somewhere ahead, beyond the immediate silence, beyond the controlled environment, something waited, something final, something that would not be influenced by status or wealth or reputation, and as the doors closed behind them, separating this space from everything outside, it became clear that whatever came next would not be negotiated, it would be revealed. The sound of the doors sealing behind them was soft, almost polite, but it carried a finality that no one in the room could ignore, and as Emily Carter stepped further inside, the space revealed itself not as a place of confrontation, but of conclusion. Long glass panels lined the walls, screens embedded with quiet efficiency, displaying timelines, records, structured information that did not demand attention yet held it completely, and at the center of the room, a table waited, not for discussion, but for acknowledgement. The man in the dark suit gestured toward it without urgency. "Everything is prepared," he said, and Emily moved forward, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, because whatever was about to unfold, she had already accepted it, and acceptance has a way of removing fear before it arrives. Behind her, Nathaniel Brooks entered more slowly, his eyes moving across the room with sharp precision, searching for leverage, for weakness, for anything that could be reshaped into advantage. But nothing here responded to him, nothing shifted under his presence, and that absence of reaction was more disorienting than resistance ever could be. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, his voice controlled, measured, but now edged with something closer to strain, because complication is something he understood, something he could untangle. But this was not complication, this was structure, and structure does not negotiate. One of the screens illuminated as Emily reached the table, displaying a sequence of timestamps, quiet moments captured and preserved, the cabin of the aircraft, the movement of objects, the shift of tone, the exact moment where intent became action, not exaggerated, not dramatized, simply recorded, and the simplicity of it made it undeniable. Emily did not react outwardly, but her eyes held on the screen for a brief moment longer, not reliving it, but confirming it, because truth, once seen clearly, does not need repetition. Nathaniel stepped closer, his gaze locking onto the same display, and for the first time, he did not speak immediately, because what he saw was not something he could reinterpret, not something he could redirect with language or influence. It was something fixed, complete, and already shared beyond this room. "This can be handled internally," he said finally, the words coming slower now, less certain. "There is no need to escalate this." And the man in the dark suit responded without hesitation, his tone unchanged. "It has already been escalated." And that sentence did not rise in volume, it did not demand attention, but it ended something, it closed the space where negotiation might have existed, and in that moment, Nathaniel understood that what he was facing was not a reaction, it was a process that had begun before he even realized there was a problem. Emily placed her hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding herself not in fear, but in presence, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear. "I am not here to argue," she said, and the simplicity of that statement shifted the room again, because argument implies uncertainty, implies that outcomes are still in motion, but Emily was no longer moving with uncertainty, she was standing at the point where everything aligned, and for the first time since this began, Nathaniel looked at her not as someone to influence, but as someone he no longer understood, and that realization carried weight, because misunderstanding is something he could correct, but this was different, this was separation. Complete and irreversible, the screens continued to display their quiet sequence, data confirming itself, timelines connecting, patterns forming without interruption, and outside the glass panels, figures moved with quiet coordination, not reacting to the moment, but following a plan already set. And as Nathaniel stood there, surrounded by systems that did not bend, by people who did not respond, by evidence that did not change, he realized that whatever came next would not depend on him. Not on his decisions, not on his influence, but on what had already been done, and for the first time in a very long time, Nathaniel Brooks was not preparing to respond, he was preparing to face something that had already been decided. Silence settled in the room, not empty, not uncertain, but complete, the kind of silence that follows when every variable has already been accounted for, and Emily Carter stood at the center of it, her hands still resting lightly against the table, her posture steady, her breathing calm, because there was nothing left to brace for, nothing left to anticipate. Everything that needed to happen had already begun, and now it was simply unfolding, one measured step at a time, across from her. Nathaniel Brooks did not move, not immediately, his eyes fixed on the screens. On the quiet sequence of moments that had been captured without distortion, without interpretation, just fact, and for the first time, he did not try to interrupt it, did not attempt to reframe it, because even he understood that there are moments where language no longer holds power, where influence cannot alter what has already been established, and this was one of those moments. "This is not how this ends," he said finally, his voice lower now, not commanding, not sharp, but controlled in a different way, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else, and the words lingered in the air for a brief second before dissolving into the same quiet that had settled over everything else, because endings are not decided in the moment they are spoken, they are decided long before, in the choices that lead to them, and this ending had been set in motion far earlier than he realized. The man in the dark suit stepped forward slightly, placing a folder on the table, its presence simple, unremarkable, but definitive. "All proceedings will continue from here," he said, and there was no emphasis in his voice, no urgency, just a statement aligned with everything else in the room, structured, inevitable, and Emily did not reach for the folder right away. She did not need to, because what it represented was already clear, not an escalation, not a reaction, but a conclusion, one that had been built piece by piece until it could no longer be avoided, and when she finally looked at Nathaniel, it was not with anger, not with resentment, but with something far more distant, something resolved, like she was seeing him for the last time without needing anything from him, and that absence of need was the final shift, because power relies on being needed, on being acknowledged, on being part of the equation, and in that moment, Nathaniel Brooks was none of those things. He stood there, present but disconnected, a man who once shaped outcomes now standing inside one he could not change, and that realization did not arrive loudly, it settled slowly, quietly, until it became undeniable. Daniel Carter remained near the entrance, his presence steady, not intrusive, not dominant, just there, ensuring that nothing interfered with what had already been set in motion, his role not to act, but to witness, because sometimes the most powerful position is not control, it is certainty, and he had that, not from assumption, but from knowing exactly how this would unfold. The screens dimmed slightly as the sequence completed, the final timestamp marking the end of what needed to be shown. And the room returned to stillness, not waiting, not expecting, just complete. Emily took a slow breath, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unchanged, and for the first time since stepping onto the plane hours ago, there was nothing pressing against her, no weight, no tension, just space, and she turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just simply, and began to walk toward the exit, her steps measured, unhurried, because she was not leaving something behind. She was stepping forward into something that no longer required her to fight for it, and behind her, Nathaniel did not follow, not immediately, because movement requires direction, and for the first time, he did not have one. He remained where he was, surrounded by the quiet evidence of everything that had led to this moment, and outside, beyond the glass panels, The world continued as it always had, unchanged, indifferent, but inside that room, something had shifted permanently, something that could not be reversed or rewritten. Only accepted, and as the door closed behind Emily, the final sound was not loud, not dramatic, just a soft click, the kind that does not demand attention, but marks an ending with absolute certainty. And in that quiet, one truth remained: some men lose control in an instant, but the real cost is realizing it was never theirs to begin with.